Welcome, Doug. Great to connect here in the beautiful city of Lisbon. I'd really like to understand, tell me about Circulor and how this journey began for you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. I mean, Circulor was founded 5 years ago. Originally in London, we now have offices around the world. And the journey started with the belief that new technologies can unlock old problems. In our case, it happened to be, an interest in machine learning and distributed ledgers, and thinking, well, how can we apply that to a real-world problem where, there's a lack of trust that perhaps that could help solve. Our business is traceability in complex industrial supply chains, and that's increasingly relevant because of things like the requirement to create digital product passports. The European battery regulations creates the requirement for a battery passport, and we expect there to be others. And so today, most of our business is with auto manufacturers, but the same needs around demonstrating responsible and sustainable business applies in many industries.
But how was it, so you said technology solves problems, how was it that you came to focus on this specific problem?
I'd love to post-rationalize this as genius, but obviously there's a lot of luck. I took a week off work in 2017 and said, can I find a problem where maybe these things alongside existing technologies could try and make a difference? And I emerged from my living room after Friday evening and walked into the kitchen, spoke to my wife and said, I think we should track cobalt out of the Congo. And you can imagine she just looked at me and went, I'm sorry, what? Why? But obviously we now do that, but actually the idea was essentially growth in demand for electric vehicles, all sorts of responsible sourcing concerns for some materials like cobalt, yes, which has concerns around child labor, the need for greater trust of what happens at the upstream. The problem is owned by the downstream auto OEMs. How can you start to bring data to that problem?
So with the problem, we're talking about traceability, trackability, transparency, and visibility, I guess. But where do you see the share of responsibility sitting between consumers, the companies that are selling, and then upstream as well from the raw materials, the manufacturers, to the finished products? Where is the responsibility?
Well, it's a bit of everywhere. I mean, first of all, you have at the downstream, you have consumers increasingly wanting to see the brands that they make big purchases from acting responsibly, and ideally proving it. You have investors starting to look for meaningful evidence of ESG performance, and regulators starting to put in place regulations around, carbon measurement, ESG, local recycling, battery passports. There's a whole plethora of different things coming together to create that pressure on big manufacturers. Big manufacturers, of course, inherit much of the problems they're now responsible for from their supply chain, whether that is inherited Scope 3 emissions in an industrial supply chain, or human rights concerns or deforestation, or sweatshops in the textile industry. And this requires greater visibility of the deeper tiers of supply chains, which have never really existed.
And as you say, they haven't really existed. It's incredibly complex. So
yes,
what are the key challenges that you and Circulor are focused on to be able to give that end-to-end visibility?
Yes, so we're creating a digital twin for a physical commodity, and then a digital thread that follows that digital commodity through its journey. And if you think about rock that ends up as steel in a car, there are many stages of transformation that turn rock into things that roll. And so we focused very hard on how to achieve integrity of the first digitization of a commodity, that you can be confident it was coming from where it's supposed to be coming from, and then that you can follow the physical material through the supply chain, and then augment that, if you like, that digital thread with information on carbon emissions created at each point, or working conditions, which are really the data that people care about at the other end. It starts with a chain of custody to which you can then say, well, who are the actors, how do they work, what can I attribute to that material?
And to what degree can you trust the data that you're building this on?
Well, I don't trust people, I trust machines. So almost all the data we receive, the primary data, comes directly from production management systems or quality management systems at a refiner or a battery cell manufacturer, for example. And so, it's harder to adulterate data that comes directly from an IoT device. You then seek to augment that with information you can glean through audit or from other third-party data that allows you to judge whether what you're being told is likely to be correct or whether or not it requires further investigation.
Yeah. So obviously at Maersk we're looking at how do we decarbonize the end-to-end supply chains.
Yes.
And having the visibility, and we've also been building emissions dashboards and trying to help our customers also to see where their footprints are being driven from. you're very focused on blockchain technology, machine learning, AI as well. I mean, where do you see the big breakthroughs coming that will really solve this problem?
Well, the first thing, if this isn't clear, I mean, I think we know this, but not necessarily clear to anyone that's listening to this, is that 80% of the emissions in an industrial supply chain are inherited from the supply chain. Clearly, freight forwarding and logistics is a significant component,
yes,
but so is the processing activity that turns, I mentioned rock, into things that roll earlier, that transforms raw materials into things that are eventually consumed in an industrial process. And so you have to deal with both of those. I mean, Maersk has shown real leadership through TradeLens in digitizing, your core business to build trust in what's going on within the movement of things. But we are focused very much on the bit in the middle between each of those segments, what happens in that industrial process. These are complementary solutions, and actually that digitization, that data, the visibility into the deeper tiers of supply chains is a journey we're both on.
In the Nirvana situation, I mean, how would you envisage companies making different types of decisions with this information?
Well, the very first thing we already are trying to do with some of our customers, like auto manufacturers, is to help them buy smarter. You can't manage something you can't measure. So the first thing is you show them what's going on. Then, of course, well, what do I do with this information? If I'm getting spikes in my inherited emissions, which tier 3 or 4 suppliers were involved in this that create those spikes in emissions? Therefore, how do I try and either help those suppliers operate more sustainably, or potentially find different suppliers who can produce more sustainable materials? Buy smarter is the first step.
Buying smarter.
Yeah.
But how about selling smarter? What is the consumer's role going to be in this once this all becomes transparent?
Yeah. Increasingly, the scope 1 and 2 emissions profile of an individual actor in a supply chain is something that is sought by downstream, because of course they're inheriting the problem. When it comes to selling smarter, being able to demonstrate what you're doing and the path you're on to decarbonize or do business more responsibly is something that's increasingly attractive to downstream actors. Platforms like yours and ours are helping those organizations who are on a journey to trying to do things better to actually advertise what they're doing in a way that can be trusted, that encourages more people to want to do business with them.
Fantastic. Well, whether it's luck or genius, it's fantastic what Circulor is doing. So thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.